Hello and welcome to the Sack for Wrong Think podcast. It's Monday, the 27th of January. As some of you may know, I'm an HR professional, have been for on and off for about 30 years. And one of the things I've been very concerned about, particularly in the last 10 years, has been the creep of politics into the workplace and ideologies, and some quite radical ideologies. And this has resulted in employer overreach. Human resources departments are rightly getting a lot of the blame for this, but they're not solely responsible. Many of the worst things in the world started off as a good idea. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And back in May last year, I published a series of articles in the Daily Sceptic, links below, exploring how EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion, took over the British workplace. And you can probably apply the same causes and reasons to other countries as well, particularly in the Anglosphere. So what I'm going to do is run through this article. I think it's as relevant now as it ever has been. I think it's important for people to understand how this has happened, because until we understand how this has happened, we can't fix it. And just changing laws won't necessarily fix this. We've got a cultural issue here where a whole two generations, maybe, certainly one generation of managerial class have been essentially taught ideology that demands that you enforce political orthodoxy and compliance to an ideological perspective within the workplace. And of course, this has all been done for the very best of reasons, or at least that's what we've been told. Anyway, without any further ado, I'll go into the article. So it was published on the 14th of May, 2024, in the Daily Sceptic. I will put a link to that. How have we got ourselves into a scenario where merely holding a dissenting opinion in what is meant to be a pluralistic society can result in the loss of your job and career? Why are employers, large and small, implementing policies and training which they think are well-meaning but which often result in those same employers actually acting unlawfully, discriminating against employees and damaging their employee relations, colleague relations, engagement and ultimately productivity? There is a growing concern that well-meaning but deeply flawed execution of policies and training in equality, diversity and inclusion, EDI or DEI in the United States, has had exactly the opposite impact of the one intended. The Department of Business and Trade published an in-depth objective report in late March 2024, which highlights this and urges urgent action to course correct. The Dinata survey behind the Free Speech Union's independent report of March 2024 indicates that the majority of workers who've been through some form of EDI training, some 63%, felt that the contents of the training conflicted with their own opinions and beliefs. More disconcertingly, 12% of those surveyed say they have witnessed someone being sacked because of this conflict. Even if 90% of those witnesses were mistaken, extrapolating to the wider population, that's over 200,000 who may have been sacked for what George Orwell called wrongthink. And when you see what's happened with the likes of Graham Lynham, the man behind Father Ted, it's not a huge leap to conclude that if it's bad in the world of celebrity, what's it like for normal folk without a platform to defend themselves? Furthermore, if we take those who've been sacked out of the equation for a minute, the impact on staff engagement and morale cannot be underestimated. And this may go somewhere to explaining the disastrous productivity figures in the UK economy in recent years. So once again, how on earth did we get to this situation, and what on earth do we do about it? This is the first in a series of 3 articles I'm writing around how this has happened. EDI has been present in employers in the UK for over 20 years now, but it's only fairly recently that it has become all-encompassing to the point where it controls employer culture to such an extent that sometimes even CEOs are too terrified to challenge it in their own companies and organisations, and government ministers in their own portfolios. Here, in part 1, we examine how the COVID crisis and the death of George Floyd turbocharged workplace EDI from 2020. Part 2 will examine how the creep of environmental, social and governance (ESG) policies in the investment sector and the civil service has forced EDI through supply chains into small employers. Part 3 will examine the impact of all of this and the various approaches to fixing it. So, how the death of George Floyd and lockdown saw the turbocharging of EDI of sometimes highly dubious quality into the British workplace. By the summer 2020, we were well into the COVID crisis. HR departments were up to their ears managing how to keep people working in a society that had closed down. Working from home issues, staff welfare, furlough, sickness, social distancing, vaccine policies, testing policies, all of which needed careful navigation with an eye to what was happening, but also on the long-term risk of any hasty decisions. UK HR departments were, on the whole, careful to support the concept of bodily autonomy in the UK and to resist vaccine mandates that many other Western nations adopted and which are now being examined by those nations' court systems. Then on May the 25th, we had the death of George Floyd. The reaction to this instance was extraordinary, and the speed at which it went viral was truly astonishing, fueled by millions stuck at home and isolated, viewing the world through the letterbox slit of social and mainstream media. Now, I'm not going to discuss the subsequent BLM protests here. Rather, we're looking at how this impacted British businesses and employers. Now, there was a great deal of outcry in the UK as elsewhere, as we saw many employers openly express their concern, and many wanted to be seen to be doing something. So HR teams suddenly had CEOs and boards demanding that they implement initiatives like unconscious bias training, convinced they had a serious systemic racist issues in their workplaces, despite the ample evidence that this was in fact very rare in the UK. There were also demands to up the ante on EDI, and all this at a time when the HR teams were themselves massively stretched. So, what do you do when you lack the in-house resources to address a situation? Well, you outsource and you recruit. This resulted in a huge demand for external EDI training and an equal demand for EDI specialists. The problem with both were being in a very short supply in the UK market. Any high-demand market sees a rapid increase in supply and a drop in quality. This situation was no exception. The USA was somewhat better supplied for both, and training businesses seeking to meet the demand adopted American DEI training courses without paying attention to the content. DEI training in the USA has a huge focus on race, which may be unsurprising given the often turbulent history of race relations in that nation. Unfortunately, many of these courses were copied or purchased by UK trainers and delivered to our employers in the UK without consideration that the contents may be both irrelevant and potentially damaging to employee relations in Britain. This resulted in the rapid adoption of highly controversial critical race theory, CRT, in many UK institutions. Now, I'm not going to debate the pros and cons of critical race theory here. Suffice to say that it's caused major issues when implemented into the UK workplaces as gospel, particularly because it alters the definition of what constitutes racism, and that definition conflicts with the UK Equality Act 2010. It's essential that employers stick to the Equality Act version to avoid acting unlawfully. Now, the UK has its own history of race relations and tensions that we need to address in our own way. What doesn't help is adopting those of a foreign nation, which has had its own issues in the area, and to assume that they also apply in the UK simply because we share a language. Here's an example. When a colleague was window shopping for an EDI training company in September 2020, she was briefed on course content by one provider, where one module looked at the impact of segregation laws on contemporary systemic racism. She questioned the training company about why this was relevant to the UK. We have never had peacetime racial segregation laws, certainly in modern times. The only one I can recall was the ban on English and Scots marrying in the border regions in the 16th century, when those two countries were still separate from each other, to try and curb the organised banditry that was rife in the area at the time. Apparently, the response from the trainer wasn't satisfactory, as they couldn't explain why this module designed for the USA, where racial segregation laws did exist, was in any way relevant to the UK. EDI jobs have been all the rage from 2020, and a large number of quite inexperienced executives were elevated to positions where they suddenly became responsible for a significant chunk of employee training and consequential oversight of much of employer culture. Unfortunately, this saw an influx of radical activists, as well as those who simply lacked the knowledge of UK employment laws, into such roles. Many were very young, their previous experience of organisational culture being their university, where radical ideas can flourish but probably should be left in the junior common room. Judging by some of the output from such, there were some serious issues around what they were proposing. For example, an unconscious bias training course at one organisation we encountered essentially took the critical race theory idea that all white employees were born racists. We pointed out to the HR director of that company that, given 2/3 of her employees were white middle-aged women in a care profession, it probably wasn't the best idea to accuse them all of racism on the highly racist basis that they had been born with white skin, and that this might backfire horribly given it was unlawful. Indeed, where HR directors and leadership had the time, such policies were tempered. But in some organisations, they were adopted hook, line and sinker, resulting in unlawful practices entering the employer-employee relationship, including the steamrolling of the faith and belief guarantees within the Equality Act 2010, which meant many minority groups themselves were caught as dissidents. In some organisations, the lack of EDI teams or departments and the desire to be seen to be doing something resulted in the appointment of action groups of minorities within the organisation. So we saw BAME, LGBTQ+, disability act groups and such being established, and asked and tasked to come up with policies to make employers more inclusive and welcoming to individuals identifying with those groups. In quite a few scenarios I had came across, this degenerated into an absolute disaster, causing conflict, anger, resentment, and in some cases disciplinary situations within the groups themselves, let alone in the rest of the organisation. Sensible HR directors quickly round down this idea. Others, not so sensible, or perhaps out of fear, or just being too busy, allowed these advocacy groups to set the agenda. And they did, often with the same fervour as those citizen groups that were so characteristic of the reign of terror during the French Revolution. Only the result was, thankfully, not the guillotining of dissenters, but the hunting out and persecution of any employee or manager who challenged the findings of those advocacy groups. And of course, all this was amplified by the lack of person-to-person contact that always tempers tempers. It is a rule of the modern age in which we live that people will behave appallingly on social media or over a video meeting in ways they would never dream of doing in a first-person interaction. The workplace is no exception. And the filter of those coffee machine chats, which do so much to knit cohesion in the workplace, the informal conversations that remind us we're all flawed human beings, was removed by lockdown and distancing. The reality uncovered in the government report and the Free Speech Union survey data mentioned above, as well as what we see with our own eyes, is causing concern to many in the HR sector. Chief executive officers now demand to know why employee engagement is on its knees. Staff turnover is so high, productivity levels have cratered, and creativity's disappeared. It's becoming quite clear that the rush to implement EDI after George Floyd has resulted in the widespread adoption of quite radical policies and political partisanship that was unthinkable in the British workplace a mere 10 years ago. This is causing major problems for the employer-employee dynamic, colleague relations, and ultimately productivity. We will look next time into what happened and what we can do about it. In the meantime, coming next, how corporate and public sector procurement force EDI down the supply chain. Thank you for listening. If you appreciated that, please like and subscribe, and please consider joining and subscribing with us to us on Substack. We publish the stories of those who've been fired or cancelled, who don't have a platform, and we need your help to do that. So if you can do that, we'd be very grateful indeed. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening.